ideology, the denial of genocide, while at the same time building a framework of freedom of expression that will respect that right and other human rights that supposedly hang on freedom of expression. This is the history that we've just heard about, and I characterize that history as an abuse of freedom of expression that helped to facilitate the genocide in 1994. The ICTR media case we have heard about, I had the privilege of working on some of the documentation on this and even doing some background research on what happened in this case and the meaning of it. Unfortunately, the previous speaker did mention many of those convictions were overturned on appeal, so that those individuals who misused the media in 1994, the convictions that stand today have to do with their personal involvement in the genocide rather than what they did through the media. So at the beginning there was a kind of, if you will, victory for those who wanted to look at limitations of the press, but unfortunately, in my opinion, the appeals chamber of the tribunal reversed those convictions. So even though it's called the media case, we truly don't have any outstanding convictions based on the activities and the misuse of the media in 1994. Independent researchers in Rwanda have since then documented the existence of genocide ideology and denial of genocide in Rwanda. And I want to focus both on the internal dynamics in the country and also externally, because we know those of us who are outside of Rwanda have our part to play in the reconciliation and the progress of the country, just as we had our part to play in prevention and stopping the genocide and did not step up to that role. Rwanda faces this continuing threat of those individuals who have said, even in public broadcasts, that they intend to finish the job that was started in 1994. Those of us who here in the West have the luxury and the distance, if you will, of talking about freedom of expression in a very isolated way, kind of calm, peace, and safety. But this is a real ongoing threat inside the country of those who have their minds made up that if given a chance, they will continue with the extermination that started in 1994. Having that knowledge and based upon the research that was done by the government, the parliament, independent research institutes in the country, the government of Rwanda took the step of criminalizing what is called genocide ideology, genocide denial, minimization, support, everything that you could do to say that killing individuals based on their ethnicity and the other characteristics that are outlawed in the Genocide Convention, the government has closed those doors in domestic law. Now, unfortunately, there are some individuals, critics, political opponents, who have been using the internet, using traditional media, criticizing the genocide denial law, the genocide ideology law, as a tool of the present government for political suppression. They are also engaged in a very organized, concerted effort to deny that the genocide happened in Rwanda. And that takes the form of double genocide, questioning the number of victims who were killed, mixing and convoluting who did what and when, so that not only outright denial, but minimization, recharacterization of what happened. This is the strategy, very subtle, and they've been very successful, if you look at social media today, in getting that message out, not only in Rwanda, but in the rest of the world, so that the dominant picture that's out there is one other than what we know to be the documented truth. As a discussion, especially in social media, is taking place today. A number of these voices have influenced reporters at the New York Times, people who give recognitions and prizes, and media organizations, and Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International. Those people who control, if you will, the knowledge-making industry in the Western world have been influenced by this campaign and these voices that have cast doubt and aspersion, that have minimized and outright denied the genocide against Tutsi. One of the main instruments for this campaign, ICTR defense attorneys, people who I worked with for several years, who would not even use the word genocide in the legal proceedings as they defended those times to say genocide happened. They always talked about the events, the massacres, the killings, but they would not use that word. So this didn't start by individuals who are removed and unsophisticated. These were people who knew very well what they were doing, and so others have taken the lead, starting with the defense attorneys at ICTR, to talk about what happened in 1994 as other than genocide. Social media and internet, as I said before, have taken up the cause, and one of the things that those critics and opponents have been successful in doing is getting the traditional media to use the language that they have adopted, starting with the ICTR attorneys, to say there is not political space, if you will, in Rwanda to discuss and debate. And if you do a content analysis of those people who are, we would call genocide deniers, and then look at media coverage and some of the think tanks in Washington and in New York and elsewhere, and see how much they parrot those exact phrases, those exact terms of those who are trying to minimize, negate, and deny the genocide. Human Rights Watch and its various reports. I'm not saying it's a total watch. They have done some good things, but if you look very carefully at the Human Rights Watch campaign, those detractors and deniers are starting to have influence on the conclusions that they draw and the types of analysis that they do to report about Rwanda. The New York Times has a very close relationship with Human Rights Watch. There's a circle of one person quotes the other, the New York Times repeats it, and whether or not that claim is authenticated or not, it's presented to the general public as true. And I've done a study of this circular argument and infusion of the genocide minimization denial by way of Human Rights Watch and the New York Times report. Amnesty International and its various reports on what's going on with the genocide ideology law and the genocide denial law picks up some, again, the language of these people who would try to detract and diminish and minimize what happened. Reporters Without Border, even so, making the main claim that there's government suppression going on by way of the genocide ideology law that was created. Policy advocacy organization, the Atlantis Foundation, for example, was mentioned before as one that had really gone forward with the views and the opinions of others who are on this campaign of genocide denial and genocide minimization. Next. One of the reasons we see that, and that needs more analysis and discussion, even from those of you here who are conversant with Rwanda and what happened in 1994, is to look at how we make analyses and discussions and reporting on what happened in Rwanda and how the country is trying to rebuild and move forward. That is, we take our standards here in the West, our ideological hegemony, and place them in Rwanda and say, as we have evolved, as we have developed, we expect you to go through this, despite the fact that you have different circumstances and different challenges. And so this kind of interpretation and implementation of human rights, very broadly defined, of which freedom of expression is considered centrally, presents some problems when you look at the genocide ideology law that Rwanda has promulgated. We also see this absolutist view that we take, especially in the United States, about freedom of expression comes above everything, and we need not touch those who want to say, deny, minimize, or involve in any kind of discussion that they please. Now, I have put this slide on to show you that this so-called double standard that I've talked about before in different forms exists. When you look at Rwanda's genocide ideology law and its denial, it's not uncommon considering the ones that are in Israel, in Germany, in France, and in many other countries in the European Union. A recent development in Australia was the case of Etok versus Bull, where an anti-discrimination law was considered upheld by the courts in Australia, saying that freedom of expression does not allow a journalist to make characterizations and accusations about ethnicity in a society and to insult members of the society. Freedom of expression has that limit. The next one that I think is most prominent and appropriate for our context is our own restriction on threatening the life of the President of the United States or anyone in succession of the presidency. I talked about this several months ago, and then just in January of this year, we have a very prominent case that has been swept on the rug a bit of a Jewish newspaper in Atlanta, the editor wrote an editorial that was characterized as a threat to the life of President Obama. And this incident has been investigated by the Secret Service and other law enforcement, and the editor has since resigned from that paper. The point of this is that we have recognized in our own society that there are limits to what you can say. This part of the U.S. Code says that you cannot threaten the life of the president. The genocide ideology law, the genocide denial law in Rwanda said that you cannot threaten and intimidate populations, groups in a society. And somehow Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and some of these other organizations find those kinds of prohibition in the context of genocide to be illegitimate when we have here in the most stable democracy with the longest history of freedom of expression, limitations on a certain kinds of speech when it comes to threatening the life of a single individual. And we found those to be acceptable limits, because if you talk about someone in a remote part of Rwanda saying that I'm going to go out and finish the job, then they're criticized, the government is criticized for saying that speech ought not to be allowed in a society in the context of genocide. Recognizing that the international community did not do what it should have to respond to the rhetoric in Bosnia and in Rwanda in the 1990s, the months preceding genocide, the Secretary General of the United Nations, that's Kofi Annan at the time, said that maybe under the responsibility to protect doctrine, governments can and should ban expression that could incite violence. And so we have, as a developing regime, looking at differences in our societies, especially those recovering from genocide, setting these limits, as a previous speaker has mentioned, about what is tolerable speech in a society versus things that will plunge the society back into division, back into hatred, back even into the recurrence of genocide. Rwanda has acted responsibly. If you take the present regime of what is allowable to promulgate these laws, even though they have limitations of freedom of expression, so as to fulfill its responsibility, next slide, to prevent the recurrence of genocide, fulfill its responsibility to rebuild the society after the genocide in 1994. The challenge now remains for Rwanda, given how the international legal regime of freedom of expression has evolved, given those limitations that has been set in Israel, in Germany, in France, even those that we recognize in the United States. How can this country, coming out of this terrible past, the abuse of freedom of expression, and the need to promulgate freedom of expression as much as possible, tailor the genocide denial law, the genocide ideology law, to allow for historical, political, and scientific discussion of the subject that does not go over into what we call incitement, as we saw in 93 and in 94. And so those limits on freedom of expression and the role of the media in carrying the voices of people who disagree and who want to talk about the history. How do you have a discussion and debate of the history and the present without allowing what happened in 93 and 94 to recur, that is now I'm going to be targeting, I'm going to be persecuting, I'm going to be demonizing, and all of the things that we saw, strategies that led up to the genocide. This is the challenge for Rwanda. We've had some discussions with the Ministry of Justice and with the Prosecutor General's office looking at this issue, and even now as we speak, those laws are being refined and really revised so that the interest of the society can be protected, while at the same time recognizing the need to protect freedom of expression and to continue forward with this human rights regime that is, for the most part, been an asset to countries in the world that struggle with discussion and debate, political change, but not to go back to the days of Kangura and RTLM and hate radio. This is just the beginning of it. Thank you for your indulgence on it, but it's something that we all want to pay attention to, looking at previous societies, looking at our own society, and to recognize that there are limits to freedom of expression, and setting those limits in Rwanda is a little more challenging than it would be in France or even in Germany or the United States. Thank you.